Hi, everybody. I'm Alana Umansky, and as everybody else on the panel said, it's really a pleasure to be here. And I'm going to be narrowing in a little bit and talking about inequality for a specific category of students, those that are classified in schools as English learners. And I want to sort of explore this. Ken sort of it was a great moving from Ken's presentation because he was talking about these classification systems, and I'm going to be really trying to delve into that and understand what are the pros and cons of EL classification specifically as a kind of classification for a protected group of students. So first, to give a little bit of background, throughout much of the history of the US, immigrant children and students whose primary language was a language other than English have faced one of two types of treatment in US public schools. The first has been exclusion and segregation and inferior resource access. And this was particularly prevalent in the Western states. Up through relatively recently, a lot of immigrant students were either outright excluded from US public education or were placed into wholly separate schools or wholly separate classrooms. The second way in which immigrant students and those whose primary language was a language other than English were treated in U.S. public education was a sort of a sink or swim mentality, where immigrant students were simply placed into mainstream classrooms without teachers who had any preparation to teach students who didn't have proficiency in English. And without any kinds of supports or systems in place for them. Actually, San Francisco, you guys, many of you may know this, but San Francisco is the district where there was a case against the school district saying that you cannot simply place immigrant students into classrooms, students who don't speak English into mainstream classrooms and expect them to have equal access. And that case went up to the Supreme Court and became Lau v. Nichols, which is sort of the bedrock of policy and law concerning how students who aren't proficient in English should be treated in school. And basically the bottom line of Lau v. Nichols is that students who aren't proficient in English are a protected class of student. And those the basic protections that they have, the first has to do with classification, that they need to be identified in school. And they're called different things, and this classification is called different things in different parts of the country and also over time, but generally we call it English learners. They need to be provided direct instruction in the English language. That's the second main protection. The third protection is that they need to be offered accessible grade level core content instruction. And accessible meaning that they are able to access that content given their level of understanding of the English language. And fourth, that they need to be evaluated annually in order to be assessed for exit or reclassification out of English learner status. So those are sort of the four basic protections that were established through Lau v. Nichols, but also in ESEA and in a lot of federal and state law and regulation. So the history and context of EL classification in that sense can be seen as a shield, a set of protections that were set up to ensure that these students were treated equitably and that they had access, similar access to schooling as students who enter school already proficient in English. Yet practitioners across the country, as well as a growing sense among researchers, have seen a second side of English learner classification, one that can be thought of more as a sword in the sense that it can harm students' outcomes by impacting their experiences and their opportunities in problematic ways. So in this presentation, I'm going to outline whether and to what extent English learner classification works as intended as a shield for students, and whether and to what extent it operates as a sword for classified students. I'm going to show you a bunch of results. So unlike some of the other presentations, I'm not going to narrow in on one study. I'm going to show you sort of a bunch of results from a bunch of different studies. However, they're all going to take place in one anonymous school district. And I have been able to replicate some of these findings in a state-level data set and also a different district. And there's also other studies by other people who have also replicated, and in some cases found some different results. So we can talk about that more later if we want to. But this is a large urban school district with a very large English learner population, about 40% of incoming students. So first, talking about the SHIELD. So as I said, the core protections are, or the core services that English learners are supposed to receive are annual assessment in English and their English proficiency in order to assess them for exit, English language development instruction, and accessible core content instruction. So this is showing, and I sort of hodgepodge together a bunch of different tables, so don't look too closely at like whether the columns align. This is showing, and I'm going to show you a bunch of regression discontinuity results, not only that, but a bunch of them throughout this presentation. This is showing regression discontinuity results looking at 2 moments in time. First is the top rows there are the elementary school analysis. So that's looking at incoming kindergartners who are classified or not classified as English learner as they come into kindergarten, and their first grade outcomes, first grade treatment effects. And unfortunately, at that level, I don't have a lot of information because I'm using administrative data on their service provision. So I really can only look at, are they administered the English proficiency test or not? And again, because this is RD, these results only apply to students who are right close to the cutoff of EL classification, those who fall just below and are classified as English learners, and those who fall just above and are not classified as English learners. And then the second moment in time that I'm looking at is the transition to middle school. So students who are EL classified in 5th grade get evaluated at the end of 5th grade and fall right near the cutoff as they move into 6th grade, either EL or reclassified fluent English proficient students. So what you can see here is that the annual assessment the EL classification triggers the annual assessment in a very dramatic way, about 90 percentage points. However, and we also see that at this middle school level where I can look at more service provision, EL classification also results in intended treatments. So you can see it, EL classified students at the margin are 35 percentage points more likely to be in an ELD class, and 20 percentage points more likely to be in some form of accessible core content instruction. So it is operating as a trigger. The EL classification is operating as a trigger in these ways that we intend. But it's a little bit, especially in terms of these service provision ones at middle school, the effect size is a little smaller than you might imagine it would be. So it's interesting to think about why that is, that these services are not really functioning as, EL classification is not functioning as an on-off switch for these services. At least at the middle school level. And so you can see here that, for instance, for ELD, this is just showing the proportion of students who are EL and who are reclassified at the cusp who are in ELD. And only 38% of ELs who are at the cusp are in ELD in 6th grade in this district. So that's really driving this ELD thing that you would think, and in fact in this district has a policy that all English learners should be in an English language development class, but they're not. Only about a little over a third are. And similarly, the accessible core content instruction, the sort of diminished impact size there is being driven by the fact that a lot of reclassified students at the margin are in accessible core content classes. And that, I think, has to do with this district's effort to make accessible core content sort of the norm rather than the exception, and to provide more integrated classes. But it's still interesting to see that EL classification is not operating as a switch. So now let's think about the sword and whether EL classification is operating as a sword for these students. So this graph is showing you regression discontinuity effect sizes for incoming kindergartners who are classified as EL or not EL as they're moving through time, moving across grade levels. This is ELA and this is math. Here's the 0 line. So you can see that for students at the margin, EL classification harms both their English language arts and their math achievement over time, and that harm increases as they move through grades. So this is this is really surprising, right? If EL classification is intended as a shield to protect students and to ensure fair and appropriate treatment, why are we seeing that classification itself is actually hurting students, at least those students at the margin in this school district? And so I'm going to show you a few different things of what I think are some of the mechanisms that are emerging in the literature as to why this may be happening. And the first, which also speaks to some of the work that Ken was just showing, has to do with EL classification as potentially limiting access to core content. Here again, these are, again, regression discontinuity results. And this is now showing that the transition to middle school juncture. And so what you can see is that EL classification as students transition to middle school does not impact whether they're in honors level classes versus remedial level classes, but it actually impacts what classes they are in. Like, are they in an English language arts class? Are they in a full course, a full load of classes? And so what you can see here is that students at the margin who are classified as English learners are 7 percentage points less likely to be in a full course load and are taking fewer English language arts credits and are significantly less likely to be in English language arts at all. So I think that's one thing that's happening. A second thing that is happening is that EL classification is impacting students' access and interactions with their peers. This is looking at incoming kindergartners and their access to peers in the first grade. And you can see that EL classification at the margin here results in access to 7 percentage points fewer English proficient students in the classroom. So that amounts to about 1 to 2 fewer students in each classroom. And this has been shown, access to English fluent peers has been shown to be important for English learners for that authentic engagement in the English language. Third, there's growing evidence that and this also speaks to the last presentation, that English learner classification can alter your access to other key services. And so this is a survival analyses that's looking at the likelihood of being identified for special education based on whether students were ever an English learner, dotted line, or were never an English learner, the solid line. And you can see that by the time students are in high school, those who were ever English learners, controlling for a number of background characteristics and prior achievement, et cetera, are 5 percentage points less likely to be identified for special education and to be receiving special education services. And finally, English learner classification may be impacting students' outcomes or operating as a sword by influencing the way that students see themselves and also the way that others see them, their peers and their teachers see them. So we conducted some interviews with teachers and administrators to ask them about the supports that are in place for English learners and how they believe those students are perceiving those supports and their experiences. And I think we did about 20 or 25 interviews, I can't remember, and basically this exact story happened about 5 times in our interviews, like literally this story. And it was shocking to see how similar teachers recounted something like this. So I'll just read this to you. This is an elementary school teacher. I asked, do you play with the kids? And I didn't name them, but the English-only kids. And they said, yeah. I said, do you see anything different about yourselves? Because I was curious. And one of the English learner students said, oh yeah, Ms. Contreras. They go, they're much smarter than us. I said, but what do you mean by that? They go, oh, they're smarter. They're always raising their hand. They speak better English, and they can read better. And they read the good books. And they go, they're much smarter. So this idea that English learner classification may be in some way impacting students' sense of themselves and their own identity and their own strengths in the classrooms.